How many people here have sent off their DNA to be analysed? So about half of you. So I was told that this wasn't just to be the beginner's class. Those of you who haven't, I do have some family tree DNA kits if you want to do it later, if I convert you. So I call this how to get the most out of your autosomal DNA results. I am recording it, so if you heckle me, you'll be recorded as well, and hopefully it'll go up on YouTube eventually. If you want to read the notes later, all you need is that address, http://pwaldron.info/APG, and I've put it up on my Facebook page already if you can find me on Facebook. So the theme of the talk is that DNA testing is not a substitute for genealogical research, rather the two approaches help to corroborate each other. Genealogists have been compiled. Can everyone read that? Is the print big enough? Or do you want a little bigger? Might be better. Genealogists have always been trying to reconcile the oral tradition passed down in families with the written record that we find in archives and libraries and various other records. Now we have a third strand of evidence that we have to combine with those two, the DNA evidence that 10 years ago we certainly didn't have as regards autosomal DNA. 20 years ago we didn't even have it as regards Y DNA, the Y chromosome that comes down with the surname. The boundaries between the oral and the written are sometimes blurry. I like to question everything I find, even in a written archive. I think of death certificates in particular, where you have the grief-stricken survivors trying to give information about the person who has died. They may not know the age of the person who has died. They may not know the first names of the deceased parents. They certainly may not know the maiden name of the deceased mother. Even if they do know it, the registrar may ask you in your grief for the father's name and the mother's name, and sometimes the informant will give his own father's name and his own mother's name instead of the deceased father's and mother's name. So everything needs to be questioned, and Fiona taught me many years ago the first lesson in genealogy is verify everything. Family letters and diaries are something else that we might need to question. This is a book I was looking at this week. Somebody sent me a PDF version of this. I think it was privately circulated within the relevant families back in 1991. Cosgrove, Corey, Martin and Ryan. And I was studying this page the other day. Can you read that? Will I blow that up a little bit? I don't even know who wrote this. I'm told it was written by Father Ryan. But there were two Father Ryans. There were both Father Peter Ryan. There were both parish priests in Kilrush. There was one other parish priest in between them. I think it was the younger man who was the nephew of the older man who wrote it. But anyway, it's the history of the family of the two Father Ryans. And he decided to write down what he could remember from listening to the family history. Starting with an ancestor whose first name he didn't know, but he was a Ryan. Not as common a name in West Clare as it is in Tipperary, thankfully. And he knew, or thought he knew, that his wife may have been a Ket because there were close connections between the Ryan and the Ket families. And I just happened to be at a meeting on Monday with two people. One is a Ryan descendant, the other is married to a Ryan descendant. And they kind of let slip in conversation during the meeting that the mother of one and the mother-in-law of the other were somehow related, quite closely related, we think. And one was a Ryan from I guess Gower, somewhere down here he mentions. Not Boher-na-Gower. Boher-na-Gower is different from the townland of Gower. Paddy Ryan of Gower. The first man that he has a name for married into a Kelly farm in Gower, and he says they are related to the Ryans of Glascloon and of the Wood. The Ryans, the same Ryans as those of Glascloon and the Wood. So one person I was talking to was descended from the Gower branch. The other was descended from, or married to a descendant from the Glascloon branch, and I had completely forgotten that there was this throwaway reference to the same Ryans as those of Glascloon, and now these two people were saying that we're closely related, but I can trace the families back the closest they can be as third cousins once removed. So I have a pretty good idea. Now I have two men born in the very early 1800s who we think are probably brothers, but maybe only first cousins. That's the sort of thing where there's very little archival records to go back beyond that. The Glascloon man is there in the Tithe Allotment books. Can't remember now whether the Gower man is there in the Tithe Plotman books or came there shortly afterwards. But we need something else to go back beyond that brick wall where the written record stops. We have the oral tradition, now we have the DNA. So the next thing I did was I said, can we find out who is descended from Mr. Ryan of Glasgoon and Mr. Ryan of Gower and compare their DNA. So that's the sort of example of something where we have a written record that stops in the 1820s, we have an oral record that claims to go back further, and we now have DNA evidence to put together with the other two. I have a lovely little book here. Kay's friend Vincent Carmody phoned me from Listowel last week, and he reminded me that he's the second cousin of Richard White, who's a historian in Stanford. And this book came out in 1998 and came out in Ireland in 1999, and I read it and I loved it. Hannagran is a townland near Ballylongford where this historian's mother emigrated from. I think she may be still alive, but she's nearly 100 years old. And the book is about the conflict between the written record and the oral record, between history and memory. He says, I once thought of my mother's stories as history. I thought memory was history. Then I became a historian, and after many years I have come to realize that only careless historians confuse memory and history. History is the enemy of memory. The two stalk each other across the fields of the past, claiming the same terrain. History forges weapons from what memory has forgotten or suppressed. Few non-historians realize how many scraps a life leaves. Hopefully genealogists realize how many scraps a life leaves. These scraps do not necessarily form a story in and of themselves, but they are always calling stories into doubt, always challenging memories, always trailing off into forgotten places. So now we have memory, we have history, and we have DNA as a third participant in that battle. So that's kind of the background on the philosophy of how we might bring DNA into our research. The next question is, how much are we willing to reveal about our DNA? The objective of genealogists is to rescue our ancestors from anonymity and give them some sort of identity. The objective of some people who send off their DNA to be analysed is to remain as anonymous as possible and to conceal their identity, which is something of a paradox. If you want to increase your chances of finding your long-lost cousins and your long-forgotten ancestors, then you have to tell people what you know about the first few generations, and maybe somebody will be able to bring you back one more generation. If you want to maintain privacy about everything, there's absolutely no point in putting your DNA up there, because without some other clues from the genealogical record and the oral record, the DNA will be meaningless, apart from very close relationships. So you have to, if you're using your DNA to advance your family history research, you have to attach it to what you already know of your family history. So the basic rules, what do you have to give away? I encourage everyone to reveal at least your birth surname. That's where your DNA came from. If you're a man, that's where your Y chromosome came from. If you're a woman, well, half of your autosomal DNA came with your birth surname from your father. It doesn't matter what surname you use now. If you're adopted, your adoptive surname doesn't matter. If you're a married woman, your married surname doesn't matter. It doesn't tell us anything about your ancestry. We need to know whether we're looking at a man's DNA or a woman's DNA, because men have a Y chromosome, which comes from their father, and an X chromosome, which comes from their mother. Women have two X chromosomes, one from their father, one from their mother. The DNA is going to look very different as a result. A lot of women despair because they don't have a Y chromosome, and they go to a brother or a father or an uncle or somebody and say, please, can I have your DNA sample? And then they confuse everyone by attaching a female name to the DNA sample that they get from the male, and we don't know, is that surname the birth surname of the person who provided the Y DNA sample? Don't do that. I even came across one case where you can go to one company to have your Y chromosome analysed and another to have your autosomal chromosomes analysed, and then you can link the two together. And this gentleman managed to get his files confused, and he linked his female cousin's autosomal chromosomes to his own Y chromosome. And it took forever to sort out that mess. And unfortunately, the DNA companies don't even check for that sort of basic error when they're processing your data. Any questions? Fire away if you want to interrupt. So, don't throw out irrelevant information. A lot of people throw out surnames of third cousins which have nothing to do with the surnames of their direct ancestors. You don't have to give that away. Try and avoid using pseudonyms. Here's an example I came across yesterday, and I thought I'd better anonymize it a little further. I found somebody on Ancestry. We'll call her Tara1234. That's her Ancestry username. And we discovered that she has sent in DNA samples from 2 different people. And in her email, she says they're herself and her daughter. But when you look at her pedigree chart, the DNA samples are attached to 2 women who are aunt and niece, not mother and daughter. So she's apparently linked up the DNA kit to the wrong person in the family tree. And then she decided she'd anonymize them by giving initials, MR and DC. But it turns out that these are not the real initials of either woman. Then I looked at the match between these 2 women and a lady who's coming from California next week to see where her ancestors lived. And she's probably a 4th cousin of the older lady. She's not an ancestry match to the older lady, she is an ancestry match to the younger lady. That happens. There are fuzzy boundaries around half-identical regions of DNA. So sometimes the mother might come within the threshold and the daughter not, quite often, but sometimes the mother might be just outside the threshold to be declared a match, and the daughter might be just inside the threshold, just because you can't measure exactly the length of the shared DNA segment. That's a false negative. The daughter cannot share a segment with the 4th cousin once removed, unless the mother does, or unless the father is also related to the distant cousin, which is another possibility. This lady has only uploaded one of her 2 kits to the third-party comparison site getmatch.com, so we can't even run the comparisons there to see exactly what's going on. Ancestry DNA is pretty hopeless when it comes to analysis tools. It won't let us see any more than that one matches and the other doesn't match. And this lady has uploaded one kit to GetMatch, and they have an alias and an email address, and they both begin with Molly. So I was scratching my head, where's the Molly in the family tree? Molly's the dog. And I discovered eventually, having worked all this out, that kit has been sitting there for 300 days at getmatch.com, and I've been looking for it for 300 days, and because it's called after the dog, I couldn't find it. So, you're going to defeat the whole purpose if you go to those lengths to hide. Nobody will realize that they might be related to you, or how they might be related to you, or what side they might be related to you. The other thing I advise people, you want to, if you're analyzing DNA, you'll be corresponding with dozens or hundreds of potential cousins, and you'll forget who was I corresponding with about that person, and you want to be able to search your correspondence. You can do that if you have a good email system. You cannot do that if some people are text messages and some people are in Ancestry DNA messages and some people are in Facebook messages, and you've no way of searching them all together. So share your email address and ask other people for their email address, and file the correspondence in a logical way where you can search it later. So maybe I should have given the basics at the beginning, just to remind you of the different parts of the DNA and the inheritance paths. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, and it basically can be turned into strings of letters, 4 letters, A, C, G, and T, standing for the 4 different chemical compounds that make up DNA. And everybody has a unique sequence of these letters, billions and billions of them. Where does your DNA come from? As I said, there's an X chromosome, and if you're a man, a Y chromosome. The Y chromosome comes from the father through the sperm, or the X chromosome if you're a female. So basically it's the sperm that determines the gender of the child which results, and you get 22 autosomal chromosomes or autosomes from your father. From your mother, everybody gets 1 X chromosome, 22 autosomal chromosomes, and another thing called the mitochondria. So the Y chromosome comes from father to son to grandson to great-grandson down the direct male line. If we look at a pedigree chart, like my pedigree chart, my X chromosome came with the Waldron surname from my father, from my grandfather, from my great-grandfather, from my great-great-grandfather. The mitochondrial DNA comes down the other side. Everyone gets it from their mother. Males and females have mitochondrial DNA. So mine came from my mother, from her mother, Anne O'Neill, and from her mother, I know she was Mary. I haven't been able to find a marriage record or birth records for her children because they were born before the surviving parish records, so I don't know her maiden surname. The problem with the mitochondrial DNA is generally every generation you go back, the surname changes. So we have Waldron, Durkin, okay, a second Durkin because a Durkin married a Durkin, O'Neill, and some other unknown surname as the source of my mitochondrial DNA. So I basically talked about the inheritance paths. The Y chromosome comes down the top line, the X chromosome comes down the bottom line on the pedigree chart. The autosomal chromosomes, we get 22 of them from our father, 22 from our mother, exactly 50% from each side. Approximately half of what you get from your father comes from each of the paternal grandparent, but there's some random recombination there. So on average, 25% from each grandparent, 12.5% from each great-grandparent, 6.25% from each great-great-grandparent, and after you go back a number of generations, the percentage and the amount is going to be very small, and eventually you will have ancestors who are your genealogical ancestors, but not your genetic ancestors, because the random variation means you get nothing at all from one of your ancestors on maybe the 10th or 12th generation of your pedigree. Two siblings will each have half of their parents' autosomal DNA, but not the same half, unless they're identical twins. So people often ask, is there any point in me sending off my DNA? My brother or sister has already done so. Yes, there is. I have one case where their 7 siblings have all sent off their DNA, so between them, and I work out 2 to the 7, they're probably 127, 128 of their parents' DNA. 2 children will have 3/4 of their parents' DNA. There'll be a quarter that neither have. 3 children between them will have 7/8 of the parents' DNA, and so on. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on autosomal DNA from now on. If you want to hear me talk about Y DNA, I'll be doing that for Lorna Summer School next May. Give her a plug. So there are 3 great websites for doing genetic genealogy using autosomal DNA, and I've ranked them there in order of usefulness. Getmatch.com is just a website for comparing DNA files. It doesn't have a lab, it doesn't take DNA samples. You have to send your sample to one of the commercial labs, pay them to turn your cheek swab or your spit into a data file, which you can take to Getmatch.com to analyze. Then the 2 big labs that are friendly to genealogists are FamilyTreeDNA.com and AncestryDNA. FamilyTreeDNA.com has the best analysis tools by miles. AncestryDNA has the biggest marketing budget and therefore the biggest database, 5 million and counting, but terrible analysis tools. So it's a trade-off. If you're an adoptee looking for your birth parents, I'd say go to AncestryDNA because there's a much higher chance that you'll find a close relative there. If you're looking for serious genetic genealogists to interact with, I'd say go to FamilyTreeDNA. If you're in America, the vast majority of those 5 million AncestryDNA customers are in America, so I'd say go there. If you're in some country where AncestryDNA does not take orders, I'd say you're unlikely to find your relatives there. In Ireland, it's probably 50-50, which I'd advise you to go for, or go for both. But if you go for AncestryDNA, you can actually take your data file from AncestryDNA and upload it to FamilyTreeDNA and unlock all the analysis tools for $19, or get some of the analysis tools completely free. But if you want to do Y-DNA, if you're male, you have to go to FamilyTreeDNA. It's the only one that does that. There is one other company, 23andMe. It's basically involved in genetics for health reasons, for predicting increased liability or risk of certain diseases. And from time to time it does things to encourage genealogists, but not very helpful. So I couldn't recommend it at this stage. It went into a transition process that lasted almost 2 years, which stopped anyone bothering to try and figure out how it worked. It has just switched to using a new chip and a new set of DNA markers, which is not compatible with the other companies. I fear actually that all the companies are going to have to switch, because Illumina, which makes these chips, has stopped producing the ones that Ancestry and Family Tree DNA have been using, and I don't know what's going to happen. All these comparison tools and software platforms are going to have to be rewritten for the new set of markers that are being looked at. And 23andMe no longer even hosts family trees for its customers. You can link a family tree on an external website to your 23andMe data. So that's not very helpful. It just makes the process even more complicated. So for those of you who haven't seen them, we may as well have a quick look at my match lists on all three. There's Ancestry DNA. It says these are third cousin. It doesn't say estimated third cousin, predicted third cousin, approximate third cousin. Jack McNamara is my half-second cousin because my great-grandfather was married twice, but he's also my fourth cousin because my great-grandfather's two wives were first cousins to each other. The second lady has an adoption in our family tree. I don't know how we're related. The third match is a double third cousin once removed. She's related through both of my maternal grandparents. So the relationship is not exactly what it says there. You can sort by date to see the recent ones. Some of them have family trees. Some of them have a little leaf there to say, we have found a common name between the family trees. These two have no family tree. Well, you forgive the one with the adoption for not having a family tree. But maybe this guy doesn't know his family history either, because he lost touch with the family when his father died and his parents divorced about 50 years ago. His parents divorced and then his father died. And you can search your matches. You can search by surname. You can search by birth location. I have found those searches very unreliable. I can put in a name that I know is there somewhere and it says no matches found. FamilyTreeDNA.com. So I wouldn't bother logging in before lunch because I was going to be timed out. And then I forgot to log in when I came back after lunch. But when you sign in, eventually it loads up a similar list. I have uploaded my data file from Ancestry, which is why I appear as a match to myself, just as an experiment to see how different the two data files were. There are other columns which you would see if you were on a larger screen. Because we're on the projector screen, some of the columns are hidden. It gives a relationship range rather than a precise relationship, but one of the hidden columns is actually a more precise, I'll call it more precise, a single estimated relationship. But what it can also do, because I have uploaded my family tree and indicated on the family tree the people that I know are related on my father's side and the people that I know are related on my mother's side, it divides the matches into paternal matches, which are marked in blue, and maternal matches, which are marked in red. Anthony is my first cousin on my father's side. Mary is my first cousin on my mother's side. I encourage them to send off their DNA because there were other matches with adoptions in their family history, and we didn't even know whether they were on my father's side or my mother's side. Now I have some idea because I have a first cousin on each side, which are the maternal cousins, which are the paternal cousins. And getmatch.com. Sorry, the other thing I should have shown you in FamilyTreeDNA.com, and maybe I should have shown you in Ancestry, is how to get your data file to upload to getmatch.com. Suddenly it's gone to sleep on me. Waiting. Open all three together and then make a tab back between them. Getmatch is working, so we'll log into that one. And that will also time you out as soon as you turn your back, which can be rather annoying. And it has a button here to upload your raw DNA data file, and it has a button here to upload your family tree information. Ancestry DNA, you have to go back to the home page and to the settings page, and when you scroll down, no, you don't even have to scroll down, over here there's a button to download your raw DNA data file. Some people have computers which are set to save their downloads in some hidden folder that they can never find, so make sure you know where it's being saved so that you can find it again in order to upload it. And on Family Tree DNA you have a menu button up there, and under Family Finder you have a download raw data button, and it allows you to download it in half a dozen different formats, and it's this one down at the bottom right is the one that you want to upload to getmatch.com. Build 36 concatenated at the bottom right. And on getmatch.com you have a menu of free tools here in the middle, one-to-many matches, a one-to-one comparison where you can pick any two kits. If somebody gives you their kit number, which will be a letter and a 6-digit number, you can key in the number and do the comparison. You can ask things like, are your parents related? I'll come to that as an example later on. And then if you want to pay $10 a month, you get all these additional tools down here, and I particularly like the matching segment search, which will list all the DNA segments that you share with other people, and it will sort them by chromosome and start location, so that if two people match you on a segment on the same chromosome starting in the same location, the chances are that came from a common ancestor of you and both of the others. Again, I'll show you an example of that one later on. But just to show you how this compares with Ancestry and Family Tree DNA, I like to actually open these in a new tab, because then you don't get logged out quite as often. And here's a list of all the kits that I have uploaded for myself and friends and relatives who don't do email under my email address. And you click the display results, and it will give me a list of my matches with a long list of warnings at the top. And my two kits are both uploaded here, so I'm my own top match. And then you have my first cousin, another first cousin, another first cousin, a half first cousin once removed, a double third cousin once removed, a lady with an adoption which we haven't solved, two sisters who are my fourth cousins. Their grandfather was born in New York in 1900, sent off to Texas to foster parents on an orphan train, and had no contact with his birth parents thereafter. They subsequently married, and through DNA I've been able to fill in the missing quarter of their family tree, the grandfather who was fostered in 1900 and never knew where he came from. The next one is a fourth cousin. The next one is a fourth cousin once removed who took a little bit of detective work. Next one I haven't solved yet, a third cousin, and then they get more difficult. Another one with an adoption, a third cousin once removed. Sorry, they're not the two sisters. That's the fourth cousin. This is the other sister. But once you get down below the top 10 or 20, it gets difficult. So concentrate on the ones from the top down. They're ranked in order of estimated relationship. As you can see, the estimated relationship is not in the same order as the actual one. The fourth cousin once removed is 2 places above the third cousin, and so is that fourth cousin, and so is that fourth cousin. So the correlation breaks down when you go out to third and fourth cousin. It's only an approximation to what the actual relationship is. Any questions? So how do we use DNA in genealogy? What can we actually learn from autosomal DNA results? The very top of the list, if you have twins, it can tell us whether they're identical twins, where the fertilized egg has split with exactly the same DNA in both halves, and all their DNA is identical. So 2 identical twins would look like my kit from Ancestry DNA and my kit from Family Tree DNA. Fraternal twins are 2 separate eggs fertilized at the same time. They're the same as 2 siblings born at different times. They each have half of their parents' DNA, but not the same half. So I actually found one case of a match where it's quite clear to me that they're identical twins, and they say, no, we're only fraternal twins. So I don't quite understand how they could be that confused. There are a couple of wonderful charts explaining the relationship between the DNA numbers and the actual relationships. This comes from a Facebook group called DNA Detectives. The amount of DNA shared by two people is measured in a unit called the centimorgan. It ranges from 0 to about 3,500. If you share 3,500 centimorgans, you're either in a parent-child relationship or an identical twin relationship or the same person who's uploaded the kit twice. If you share something between 2,300 and 3,000 some hundred, you're full siblings. The next group of relationships are different relationships, but they share the same amount of DNA, because each step you go down the tree, you have half the DNA of the parent. So you can start off with two brothers share a certain amount of DNA if they're full brothers. If they're half brothers, they're only going to share half that amount of DNA. But if you take the full brother and the other full brother's child, they'll share half the amount of DNA as the two full brothers. So both uncle-nephew and half-brothers will share, on average, 1,800 centimorgans. And grandparent and grandchild will share the same amount. So DNA alone can't distinguish between those relationships. And then it gets more complicated when you go out to the next stage, Group C. First cousin is the most obvious example you would think of. They share, on average, about 900 centimorgans. But a half-aunt and a half-niece will share the same amount as first cousins. A great-aunt and a great-niece will share the same amount as first cousins. A great-grandparent and a great-grandchild will share the same amount. So you immediately need to take the DNA evidence and the paper evidence and put it together. And you know if there's an 80-year age gap, well, it's most likely great-grandparent and great-grandchild. If they're exactly the same age, it's more likely to be a first cousin, but it could be an uncle, half-uncle, half-nephew with a big age gap between them, and so on. The same thing with the half-siblings. If you think they have the same mother and they're born 40 years apart, well, there's something wrong. They're more likely to be an aunt and a niece than half-siblings. So I don't like that chart as much as I like this one, which uses the same relationship groups, but it doesn't tell you on the chart what the different groups are. Group A is the full sibling category. Group B is the half sibling category. Group C is the first cousin, etc. category. Group D is first cousin once removed, and other relationships where you would expect the same amount of shared DNA. So if you have over 2,400 shared centimorgans, probability is 1 that you're looking at full siblings. Up to 3,200, above 3,200, it's going to be parent-child and whatever. Sorry, am I right? Yeah, it doesn't have a column here on this for the parent-child relationship, because there's never any doubt with the parent-child relationship what category you're in. Then you have a range in the low 2,000s where it might be full siblings sharing less than the average that you would expect for full siblings, or it might be half siblings sharing more than you would expect on average for half siblings. You can't really tell. If you're around 2,250, it's equally likely to be full siblings and half siblings. But those cases are going to be rare. You're on the upper tail of the distribution for one and on the lower tail for the other. Then you've a range from 1,500 to 2,000 where you can say with certainty it's either a half sibling grandparent, one of that Group B set of relationships. Then you come to another overlap area where you can't be sure whether it's a half-sibling relationship or a first-cousin relationship. At around 1,300, it's equally likely to be both. You could be on the lower tail of the half-sibling distribution with less than average, or you could be on the upper tail of the first-cousin distribution sharing more than average first cousins. But when you get down lower in the chart, down to something like 140, you could be in any of 5 categories. You could be anything from second cousin out to fourth cousin. There's a 53% probability that you're a second cousin once removed with 140 shared centimorgans. So I turn to that chart every time I look at a comparison to see what's the range of relationships that's compatible with these numbers. So I've basically said all that, except the last bit. The less informed customers will say, so-and-so's my third cousin or so-and-so's my fourth cousin. They don't mean third cousin and fourth cousin in the sense that they know the common great-great-grandparents or the common great-great-great-grandparents. They mean they've read a header on their ancestry DNA match list and don't know what it means. So what are the DNA companies in it for? First of all, they want to separate you from your money. Second of all, they want to sell you ethnicity labels, which they assign to percentages of your DNA. You're 97% Irish, or 96% British Isles, or 37% Ashkenazi Jew, or whatever. And that's what they put in the television advertisements, and that's what sold 5 million kits. And unfortunately, most of those 5 million people are not genealogists, and we face a long, hard slog to turn them into genealogists. But there's a potential market out there for genealogy. And to various extents, these companies that run the labs are sending you elsewhere for help in finding your cousins and ancestors, because they're not giving you all the help they could. They're not giving you the tools to do the more advanced analysis. So what can we do to make more progress? Combine your known pedigree chart with your DNA results. I found somebody in a Facebook discussion the other day who didn't seem to even know what I meant by a pedigree chart. Anybody here not sure what a pedigree chart is? A chart with your father, mother, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, like that one. I could forgive people not knowing that the technical name for the data format in which we save that chart is a getcom file. So that's a bit of jargon that you have to explain, but I found you also have to explain even the words pedigree chart to people who've been doing genealogy for years. I do mine in Ancestral Quest. There are dozens of other packages for doing it. You have much more control over your data if you use desktop software. There are websites that let you do the same thing, including the Ancestry website, which will allow you to download your whole database into a getcom file, and the Family Tree DNA website, which doesn't have any download facilities at all. I have seen people who say, oh, this is a wonderful little toy, and spend hours and hours filling in their ancestors in the Family Tree DNA website, and then find they can't get them out of it and onto the getcom or getmatch website in a getcom file. And what I have started to do, and it may not have been the cleverest way to do it, maybe I should have created down here another event to indicate people who are in the DNA databases, but instead of that I have used the notes field, and I have put a tag getmatch : and the getmatch kit number. So now if I'm doing a bit of research and I want to know which of my cousins are in the DNA databases, I search, and under field selections I say show me everyone where the notes field has a getmatch tag, and everyone who is either my ancestor or a descendant within the first 999 generations of my ancestor. And it thinks for a second, thinks for a little longer when it does the other thing. And I actually have 96 known relatives who I have identified somewhere in one or other of the DNA databases, and I can say show me the results only, and it would give me the full list there, and I can scroll up and down. So when I found that story about the Ryans of Glascloon and the Ryans of Gower the other day, I went back to the progenitor of the Ryans of Glascloon, and I said show me all the descendants of this man in the DNA databases. I went to the progenitor of the other Ryan family and said show me all the descendants of this man in the DNA databases, and then I went to getmatch to run some comparisons between those two groups of people to look for evidence of relationships, which I did find. So whatever genealogy software you use, you should be able to figure out some way of tagging the people who are in the DNA databases, and then some way of pulling out a list of people that satisfy certain criteria that you can put into further analysis. And similarly, in the other direction, you have to put your genealogy information up alongside your DNA information. But you don't have to put your entire database with all your fourth and fifth cousins and your living children and grandchildren and people who are paranoid about privacy. Your DNA came to you through your direct ancestors. They're the only ones that you have to put in that file. And again, any good DNA software will say, here's your export routine. Who do I want to include? Partial. Select who I want to include. Select, well, let's go back and start with myself. File export, select partial, select people. Sorry, it's jumped again anyway, doesn't matter. That's my great-grandfather it's jumped to. And I can say just select his ancestors and with 0 generations of descendants. And I can create a file just containing my direct ancestors. They're the only people relevant to those looking for DNA comparisons. We're looking for someone who's both a direct ancestor of me and a direct ancestor of somebody with whom I share DNA. We're not going to offend any of the living cousins by publishing their detail. We're not going to risk people hoovering up our family tree and copying our data and attaching it to some family tree to which it doesn't belong. And we're not going to slow down the systems by comparing huge files with lots of people who are not relevant to the DNA comparison. So that's what my chart started out like in Ancestral Quest. When I upload it to Ancestry DNA, it gives me 10 generations. So you can't really read that. I took a screen grab that actually included all 10 generations. And they basically say if you're going to share DNA with somebody, you should find within those first 10 generations a common surname. The regular ancestry layout is a little better. It goes back 5 generations and then it lets you click on somebody in the 5th generation to get another 4 generations back from that person. That's an easier format to deal with. That's the only good thing about Ancestry, is that nice format. Family Tree DNA has a similar sort of layout. The scroll bars are a bit annoying on it sometimes. And GetMatch has a lovely layout. In those 4 you have to mouse over or click on somebody's name to see the name and date place and date information. On GetMatch it puts everything up on one line, and you can actually just search in your browser. This isn't going to work now because I'm looking at an image. So if I want to see who are all the ancestors born in Ireland, I just type Control F and type Ireland. And if we were looking at the text version rather than the picture version, it would jump to the ancestor born in Ireland or the ancestor born in Clare. And you can adjust up at the top the number of generations to be displayed. It starts with 5, which is about as much as you can absorb in one look, but you can add more if you think you need to look for an ancestor 6 or 7 or 8 generations back. So we've about 15 minutes left. Good, I've timed this reasonably well. Usually I'm jumping over things at the end. I'm just going to talk through about 3 examples of what you can do with the getmatch.com tools. So on the paid version of GetMatch, now I close the window, I'm opening it again, it's going to have logged me out and I have to log in again. Very annoying, but that's the way GetMatch works. And down here on the paid Tier 1 tools, I like to use the matching segment search. And you put in somebody's kit number, you decide do you want to see small segments or large segments. I tend to say 1,000 SNPs and 10 centimorgans because the small ones are probably either way too distant or just chance matches, and it takes far too long to look through them. And I say don't show me the graphics bar, and I submit, and I'll go and make a cup of tea or something because it could take 5 or 10 minutes to run. So once it has run, I copy and paste it, and I've written a little macro in Excel which will save it into a spreadsheet. Everybody familiar with using Excel? And I have some filters. So if I find I match some new person on chromosome 15 rather than 17, well, I've done another thing here. I've said only show me the matches greater than 20 centimorgans, so I'll clear that one. And then over here I can say somebody new matches me on chromosome 7, so I say show me all my matches on chromosome 7, and there they are, and I can scroll down and say somebody who matches me at 22 million. I can say, oh, that's the same place all those other people match me. Do I know how one of those is related to me? And that will tell me the new person is probably related on the same side as the other person with whom I share that particular segment. And that away. And we won't bother running it again. And if you want that Excel macro, if you're comfortable with Excel macros, I put it up on the website, and you can follow that link, copy and paste it. And might need a little bit of editing depending on where you want to save the files. The path name is there for where I save mine. So I was looking at this comparison yesterday. This is Molly the dog, except it's not canine DNA, it is human DNA. And I spotted this match on the X chromosome. 3 people who each match the other 2 on the same part of the X chromosome between location 40 million odd and location 53 million odd. 16 centimorgans, 1300 SNPs. That's a pretty good match. You would expect there to be a fairly recent common ancestor for a segment like that shared by 3 people. And it got even better when I looked at their family trees. Bernard and Molly are second cousins, assuming that we've turned the dog into the right person on the family tree. And they have a great-grandmother, Anne Kitson, formerly McMahon, from whom they could both have got their X chromosome. I didn't actually show you the X chromosome charts. Let me scroll back up and explain those to you. The X chromosome comes to a man from his mother and to a woman from both parents. So this is a fan chart for a man. He gets no X DNA from his father's side. He gets all his X DNA from his mother. Potentially that's a mixture of what she got from her father and what she got from her mother. The father didn't get it from his father, he got it all from his mother, and potentially bits of it come from here. So all of the coloured cells can potentially contribute to the X chromosome. And for the mother, it's a slightly different picture. For a woman, it's a slightly different picture because there's 2 X chromosomes. So a woman can get X DNA from both parents, but she can't get it from her father's father because he didn't pass on an X chromosome to his son. But you can get the bits of the X chromosome potentially from all these people. It breaks down randomly as you go back. You're not going to have them all represented in your X chromosome. There's about, I think it's a 14% chance that the entire X chromosome comes from one of the maternal grandparents, but 86% of the time it's a bit of each. So here's our example with the X again. They both can get back to this great-grandmother without going through 2 consecutive males, so the X chromosome could have come from her. And she's also related to Thomas, the 3rd person in the triangulation group. So I said, so how could Thomas get his X chromosome from the same ancestor as these 2? Because Anne is related to Thomas on his father's side, and Thomas's X chromosome comes from his mother's side. So immediately, if you know enough about DNA, you know there's a relationship there, but it's not the relationship that's behind the X chromosome DNA match. So I said, let's look and see who on Thomas's mother's side might be related to Anne Kitson, whose X DNA we're looking at. Anne's mother's name was a McInerney, so I said, let's look and see. Well, I said, let's look at all the surnames between Anne Kitson and Thomas, from whom they might have inherited parts of their X chromosome. And it turned out McInerney was the surname that jumped out as being common to both. I knew that Anne Kitson's mother was a McInerney, there's no doubt about that. Born in 1872, we have a civil record of her birth and a church record of her birth. Thomas had a great-grandmother on his mother's side who was Margaret Mahoney, and she lived after her marriage in the townland of Carrablochmore. And there's a Mahoney family in the townland of Lismuse, and I had to look at the map to see how close are Carrablochmore to Lismuse. This is the Clare Library wonderful website with the townland maps for each parish. Number 4 there is Carrablochmore, and number 16 right below it is Lismuse. And if you know your local geography, you will actually know that Killard civil parish and Kilfeera civil parish were a single Catholic parish up till the death of the parish priest in 1855, and then it was divided in 2, not along the line of the civil parish boundary, but up around here. These 2 townlands, 15 and 16, are actually now in the Kilkee Catholic parish at the southwestern side, and the rest of it is the Dundeg Catholic parish at the northeastern side. So I was pleasantly surprised to see the 2 townlands were adjoining each other, because they're out different roads from Kilkee and you don't realise how close they are to each other. So then I went looking in the local graveyard to see could I find the Mahonies of Lismuse, and Clare Library again has transcriptions, not necessarily accurate. And here's the Brown family who took over the Mahony farm, and the old inscription said this tomb was erected by Edmund Mahony in memory of his beloved wife Nancy Mahony, alias McInerney, who died 1845, aged 44 years. So I'm not 100% sure, but I have found what I suspect is a McInerney ancestor on Thomas's mother's side, from whom he could have got part of his X chromosome. So there's a very good chance that she is his ancestor and that she's closely related to the McInerney ancestor on the other side, from whom he couldn't have got his X chromosome. And if I'm right, Thomas's father and mother were third cousins, so Thomas and himself would be fourth cousins, which is at the stage where there's about a 50% chance of sharing DNA, and maybe less. So I ran him through the Are Your Parents Related tool on GetMatch, and it said no. I put his sister through it, it said no. So I would have been certain of my result if I found a segment that he'd got from both parents. I'm not so certain, but he has a sister who's a great genealogist and is one of these people paranoid about privacy, doesn't want to be in any public family trees, doesn't want anyone to have her DNA, and she's probably the one that has the segment that came from the McInerneys through both parents down to her. So we'll work on her again, see can we twist her arm. This is another case of where the Are Your Parents Related tool worked wonders. My friend Paul, I'm giving some sort of anonymity, I'm just calling all these people by their first name in case they don't want to be analysed by their full names. He has an ancestor on his father's side called Halpin, an ancestor on his mother's side called Halpin. He knows they both came from the same townland. There's only one Halpin household in that townland in the Tide allotments in the Griffiths valuation in the 1901 census and the 1911 census, and he knows they came out of the same house. But there's an age gap of about 20 years between them. So we don't know whether they're the oldest sister and the youngest sister in a big family, or whether they might be an aunt and a niece who grew up in the same house. I worked out, as I was putting this together this morning, we actually have a direct female line descendant of each of these Halpins who both sent their DNA off to Ancestry DNA. We would love to be able to compare their mitochondrial DNA, which came down, in both cases, down the female line from two Halpins out of the same house. If the mitochondrial DNA matches, those two Halpins were of the same generation and got their mitochondrial DNA from their common mother. If the mitochondrial DNA doesn't match, well, the younger lady is going to have to be a niece of the older lady, and she's got her DNA from her mother, who married into the Halpin house, which doesn't match the father's mitochondrial DNA, which the aunt would have. So I ran Paul through the Are Your Parents Related, and it found two segments on chromosome 2, which had come down to him from both his father's side and his mother's side. And I said that these are almost certainly Halpin segments. Then I went to my matching segment search, and I said, show me the other people who match Paul on these two segments on chromosome 2. And I found another lady called Kathleen, who I had been in correspondence with about her Parker ancestors and whether they were related to my Parker ancestors some years ago. And I didn't even realize that she had ancestors from Clare as well as Kerry, and one of those Clare ancestors is a Halpin. And we know that that Halpin lady was about the same age as the other two Halpin ladies, and she lived with her husband in Kilkee, which is maybe 15 miles from Drumdiggis. So pushing it in the mid-1800s, you wouldn't go much more than 15 miles to find a wife, but it's certainly possible that she's a sister, or it could be a generation or two further back to the common ancestor. So Kathleen now knows through that Are Your Parents Related to where her Halpin relatives lived, which she didn't know before. And the last one is one of these cases, like the Ryan one I talked about. This is a McInerney case that I was working on for the lady who's coming from California next week, where we pull out a whole group of people who we believe may be related to each other because their ancestors had the same surname and lived in the same townland at the same time. And everything is pointing to there being a connection, but there's no paper trail record to confirm whether they're brothers and sisters or not. So we can go to the autosomal matrix tool and key in kit numbers. In this case, we have 10 people This is why I brought the hard copy, because there's way too much to remember in that matrix without my notes. We'll go back to the family tree first, tell you about the family tree. I knew this lady, she's dead now, who when she got married in the 1960s, knew that she was very distantly related to the man she was marrying, thought they might even be doubly related, and on one side of the family they went way back and they had the same surname, but they couldn't find the common ancestor. On the McInerney side, one of them traced back to Patrick McInerney, who died in 1899, aged 80, so born about 1819. The other traced back to Honora Hawke, maiden name McInerney, who died 1849, aged 40, so born about 1809, about 10 years between them. And she told me they were brother and sister. That's oral tradition. It's too far back for there to be a paper record to confirm it, but DNA maybe can confirm it. And that would have made the couple who were marrying third cousins once removed, which is a step too far back to have had to need a dispensation anyway, so there's not going to be a note of a dispensation in the church register. Then we have another lady, Anne McMahon. She's the same McInerney lady we had in the first example. We know her age from the 1901 and 1911 census, so she was a little bit younger than the other two, but her husband married into a McInerney farm, which is right where I find the other two McInerney, where I find Patrick McInerney living in the Griffiths valuation. I found a tombstone erected by Thomas McInerney in memory of his wife Anne McInerney alias Kelly, who died in 1856, aged 61. And in Griffiths valuation we have Thomas and Patrick sharing a farm, and it's beginning to look like they were father and son. But there's one little hitch with the tombstone inscriptions, because if you work out what age was Anne Kelly when her daughter Honora, later Mrs. Hawke, was born, only 13 to 15 years old. Then nobody knew their ages in those days. Maybe Anne was a year or two older than the tombstone. Maybe Honora was a year or two younger than it says on the tombstone. We can't really reject it on the basis of second-hand evidence of age at death. Then there's the possibility that there was another sister, just to show you how variable age estimates can be, and spellings. I put her full name in here because sometimes she's Marinin with one or, sometimes she's Marinin with two ors. She was 60 in 1901, that would say born 1840 or 1841. She had a child baptized in 1856, so she probably was a little more than 60 by 1901. And in fact, she was 82 by 1911. And then she died in she died. And many years later, the family put up a tombstone listing many generations of the people buried in the family plot, and they said she died in 1914, aged 85. And we searched for a death record in 1914 and gave up and said they mustn't have registered the death. And I went back and I looked again, and I eventually found that she died in 1918, aged 95. So that gives us about a 20-year range of birth. And that Corrie Ryan, whatever other names, family history book that we had earlier says she was from Doonmore, which is 2 townlands away from where the other McInerneys were from. But one of her descendants has a family tree and ancestry and says she was born in Baltard. And I think that might only have come from having these DNA matches to the descendants of the McInerneys with documented roots in Baltard. And that ancestry tree is linked to a baptismal record from Tulla Parish, which is 30-40 miles away. So there's no way a baby is going to be born 3 days horse ride, as I called it, from Baltard to be baptized in Tulla. So that tree is all over the place. So back to our matrix. The first 2 rows share 2,600 centimorgans with each other. You can immediately say they're full siblings, and we know they're full siblings. And they are descended from Patrick McInerney. The next 2 rows are also full siblings. They're descended from Honora McInerney. The next row is descended from Bridget, who mightn't even be from Baltard at all. The next row is descended from Anne, who married the McMahon and also lived in Baltard. And then I've thrown in 4 other people who are descended from the Kelly family who lived 2 farms away, because I suspect that Anne Kelly, who married McInerney, certainly didn't come from Tulla, and probably didn't come from more than 2 farms away, which is where wives usually came from. So we have no proof from the genealogical sources. We have a lot of evidence from the oral sources, but now we can look at these comparisons. Here's the guy whose ancestor might be from 2 townlands away, and he's sharing 98 centimorgans with the people we know are from Baltard, and that would typically suggest 3rd or 4th cousin. So maybe she was from Baltard after all. And the off-diagonal cells you would expect to be blank if there was no relationship, about half of them to have numbers of 10 or more in them if there was 4th cousin once removed type of relationships. So certainly that matrix, with a lot of staring at it and counting the cells and so on, tells you we have a very good theory here that certainly the 3 McInerney's from the same townland were brothers and sisters. Some pretty good matches here between the McInerney's and the Kellys, 30s and 20s and 16s, to say Anne Kelly and Thomas Kelly, who lived 2 farms away from each other, may well have been brother and sister. It doesn't prove anything. The more and more people we can add to this matrix, the more confidence we can have in those deductions. But it's just like the oral history. The DNA can guide you in certain directions, but it won't prove anything. And, oops, I'm not 4 minutes over. So just end with some conclusions, and if you want the full details on how to do the uploads of your family trees and your DNA files, I have a page there that you can click through to with all the information.